This is experimenting with CSS selectors. In this screencast, I'm going to show you a couple of tricks that I use to try out various combinations of CSS selectors when I'm applying them to HTML script. And you can see that you'll be able to see in this that I have a couple of different ways that I go about trying things out before I actually apply them to the page. With CSS, as with almost any kind of code, it makes the most sense generally to start off small. Try with the smallest, most granular bit of code that can possibly work. Make sure that it works the way you want it to. Maybe tinker or experiment a little bit to see what the best way might be to get the result that you're looking for, and then move on. This is not only a good sort of general practice when you are going to be writing code or creating web pages or whatever, but it also happens to be a decent learning technique. So understanding how to experiment and what are some of the tactics that coders use when they need to set up an experiment and figure out how something works is a pretty important skill to learn, and that's going to be one of the sort of sub themes of this. I'm going to use a tool that I'll show you in a second called Tinkerbin, and it's an in-browser environment that gives you the ability to see the changes that you've made to your CSS selectors and your CSS rules instantly. It saves you a little bit of time. It prevents you from having to go through the cycle of saving and refreshing the browser and so forth. So it can save you a little bit of time. But if you don't want to use Tinkerbin for whatever reason, you don't have to. You can definitely do this the traditional way by just editing your code and refreshing your browser and so forth. But hopefully this will give you a couple of good hints and tactics for being able to do this kind of thing a little bit more effectively and quickly. Okay, so I'm in a web browser and I have navigated to tinkerbin.com. Tinkerbin is, like I mentioned, a tool for giving you the ability to test HTML, CSS, and also JavaScript as well too. We started using this tool in our JavaScript course, but it occurred to me that it would be useful for HTML and CSS students as well too. We're going to ignore the JavaScript panel down here for this class, but all I'm going to do is just throw in some basic HTML code and apply some CSS rules to it, and you can see how this thing works. You can see that when I first load Tinkerbin, I have a column on the left side with 3 panes, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And on the right side, I have an output pane. And this will automatically update. So this will give you a sense as to what the web page is going to look like. So my first step is going to be to type in some HTML, and I'll just go, doc type. This is going to be HTML5. So I'm going to go head title. This won't show up, of course, because we're not looking at this in a full browser, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. What I'm really concerned about with here is the body. Okay. So I'll start with an H1 element, just for laughs here. And all I'm looking to do here is type in a really basic HTML page, and then I can go /HTML. Okay, so this is a complete valid page. It only has one H1 element with a little bit of text in it. So let's take a look at how we can go about. I'm going to go down here to the CSS pane, and I'm going to try and add some styles to this. So I'll say H1 is going to be font family, Helvetica, there we go, and sans serif. Okay, so you can see this thing change almost as quickly as I type this in, which is really handy. It doesn't save you a ton of time, but it does save you a few seconds. But most importantly, it gives you the ability to do really quick experiments, right? So let's say, let me add a little bit more to this here, and I'll just go paragraph, and I'm going to say, here is some text. So let's say that I'm going to try and do what's called a reset. And a reset is basically, in CSS, the browser provides certain defaults, and the defaults can actually be different from one browser to the next. And so a reset will take all of the different properties that are put in by default. A lot of these affect text. And the properties tend to be things like spacing, margin, font size, font face, things like that. Almost every browser uses Roman style text for the defaults. Almost every browser puts a lot of padding after the H elements, the H1, H2, H3 elements, and so forth. So you might want to zero those out. So how do you do it, right? In this case, I can go margin 0, and you can see it jump, right? If I get rid of this, you can see it jump back, right? I can very easily see what the effect was when I create a rule. And then I'm going to say padding 0. Is that going to make a difference? No. So you can see that there is no padding on the H1 element by default, right? You can leave that padding in there if you want to, padding 0, but it's not going to have an effect, right? So you can see at this point I have one selector in my code. I have the H1 selector, and it is applying a font family and a margin and some padding. I have some text. What I'm actually going to do just to facilitate this a little bit more is I have an HTML page in my buffer. But before I do that, actually, I'm going to do one more thing. You can see that I have three panels right here, HTML, CSS, and then the JavaScript panel that we're not using. But Tinkerbin also gives you the ability to see just the HTML or just the CSS or just the JavaScript. And you can see these panels at the top give us the ability to switch between them. So if I click on HTML, I'm seeing just the HTML. Click on CSS, I see just the CSS. So that's kind of handy, right? So what I'll do is, I had previously copied a longer HTML page similar to this. I'm going to paste it in now, and you can see I've added a few more elements, right? I've got a HTML head, title, body. The H1 is still there. I've got a little bit more text here. I wanted some text wrap and some so forth. And then I have some subheads and things like that. And you can see that the H1 subhead is selected and it has a font change associated with it, but the H2s down there are using the defaults. So I can go back to my CSS and let's say maybe I want to add an H2 to this. Zero out the margin and maybe font family, Helvetica. Now I've actually repeated myself here, which I generally don't want to do, right? I've created the same font family twice for H1 and H2. Is there a more compact way to do that? Yes, and in CSS, what you can actually do is you can create multiple. Let me back up and get rid of this. You can assign multiple selectors by separating them with commas like that, H2. And you can see it's a lot more compact, right? It's essentially the same rule, the same CSS rule applied to both H1 and H2, right? And then if I wanted to do something special with H2, I could also go down here and say font size, 2.1 ems or something like that. And you can see that I can still apply this additional rule to H2, and that works as well too, right? So what else do we have in this HTML page? Well, one of the things that I did in here was I stuck two H2s in here. Actually, let's do it down here. I stuck two H2s in here specifically so that I could put a class onto another one. And so what I've denoted here with this class is I've said that this H2 has some additional properties. This is a red alert of some kind that I want to really draw the reader's attention to. So because I've specified the class of alert for this H2, it makes sense that I would want to create a special CSS rule just for this kind of H2, right? So I can go down to my CSS and say H2.alert, and let's say I just make the text red. So I say color, nice dark red. I like CC 0000. And you can see that instantly Tinkerbin assigns that red color to the H2 alert, but it doesn't assign it to the H2 that doesn't have the alert class. All right. Now let's say I had other elements like a P, for example. And this is also very important text. Okay, so let's say that this was supposed to get the alert class as well too, the big red text. So I say class equals alert. And now we have to change the selector in our CSS to be able to assign the same alert to this one, because the rule that we've defined based on the h2.alert selector, you can see back here, will only affect elements that have the alert class that are also H2 elements, right? But if we wanted to assign the alert class to any element that had the class of alert, then we go back and we say, just get rid of H2. And you should be able to see now that the H2 element gets its font size and the color from the alert, and it also has the original H2 has the correct font size. Okay, so that's basically it. That sort of takes you on a walkthrough of how to use Tinkerbin to experiment with CSS selectors and gives you a couple of examples of things that you would do with Tinkerbin. I'm not going to go into every single CSS selector and every kind of use case in this because it's in the reading for the course, and you can kind of take a look at that or post questions to the message boards. But hopefully this will give you a new tool that will give you the ability to get really good with selectors and to experiment to see what works and what doesn't work in a way that's pretty quick to fix your mistakes and to move forward pretty quickly.